Welcome to our masterclass. Today we are going to talk about scene transitions. We talk about all the nitty-gritty, and let's look at today's schedule. So first question, whose job is it anyway? So should you as a screenwriter be concerned about a cut? Because ultimately that's going to happen in the edit, right? That's the director's job. Transitions are in the screenplay one of the elements that you select when you format your script. One of 6 elements. That's the scene headings, description, character name, dialogue, parenthetical, and then there's transition. Transition is the cut to that flushes to the right and that introduces us to the next scene. It used to be customary that you would always write the cut to in the screenplay. That's going rapidly out of fashion. So what is left for you as a screenwriter to be concerned about at all? What should you be worried about in terms of these transitions? So first of all is the subject. What are you going to show? What are you going to write in your screenplay that is visible as the last element of the previous scene, the first element of the next scene? Because that's how stories are told, by juxtaposing images. So that is your first role. Think about what is going to be in the scene rather than how are you going to transition from one scene to the next. Because yes, very often that is the territory of the director. However, when we look at a few quotes about the topic, come across this one. Pundits and gurus will argue that the eventual director won't appreciate them and would likely utilize their own technical and artistic choices anyway. They're missing the point. Writing cinematically is very important for the spec screenwriter. Most readers are just looking for a great read, plain and simple. This is Ken Miyamoto. You can look him up if you want to know who he is. This quote is from Craig Mazin. He says, I find that directors tend to appreciate that you've written with transitions in mind because it's really important to them. And frankly, if you don't write with transitions in mind, some directors aren't going to notice and they're just going to shoot what you wrote and then it won't connect. So both really say you should be concerned about what these transitions will look like. First reason, it's a visual medium. You need to think visually, and how you go from one scene to the next, that is critical. On the page, transitions look somewhat like this. This is taken from the Oscar-nominated screenplay for The Disaster Artist, which was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay back in 2017. Here you have a whole lot of cut-tos. Normally you would never see this, but if you read, you understand, this is a different character speaking directly to a camera each time with a cut in between. From the same screenplay, we have the traditional cut to at the end of a scene, introducing the next scene. But to show that this is going out of fashion, and there are other ways of writing the cut to as an alternative to leaving it out altogether, we see how they incorporate it into the description, which makes for a somewhat more elegant read. Your eyes don't have to go all the way to the right of the page. It's just easier, and it looks less cluttered on the page. So that is a way of doing it. I'm not saying that you should start doing it in all your screenplays right now. There's still maybe people frowning upon it. Here we have established screenwriters who get away with that sort of things. Now, these are some of the considerations. When you write a transition, what are the things you need to keep in mind? In some instances, most instances, the transition needs to be fluid. The viewer shouldn't even notice. The reader shouldn't even notice. We should be engaged in the story. You should bring us elegantly, smoothly from one scene to the next. So there shouldn't be this sense of a rupture or a break. However, there are instances in the screenplay when you want to deliberately tell the reader to take a breather, to take a step back. We're now going to enter into a new territory, a new stage of the script. In those cases, you might want to emphasize the transition and draw attention to it. So those are two very different approaches, and you need to know which one you're going to tackle when you write your transition. Back to that page from the screenplay of The Disaster Artist. Yes, I love that movie. I think that nomination was well deserved, and I would have been just as happy if it won. There are, as I said, elegant ways of seducing your viewer, your reader, from one scene into the next. And this screenplay uses one right there early at the beginning. So Greg, at the end of this scene, asks a question. Would you want to do a scene together? And that's how the scene ends. On Tommy's face, we cut to the next scene, and then in the next scene is the answer. So that's one of the transition tricks that we found on the Script Notes podcast. And here's the overview of the 5. Question and answer, that's a really powerful, really easy one that you should keep in mind. It really empowers the reading of the script. Thematic echo, that's where 2 images, one before and after transition, answer each other, have something to say. So the start of the new scene says something about what we've just seen before. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Micro macro, very effective if you want to create a more obvious rupture, if you want to kind of shake your audience awake. Music and sound may be a bit more technical, and we'll talk about subject and format in a minute. It's very common. It's often the territory of the director, where we hear dialogue of the next scene in the previous scene, or vice versa, or you have a split screen where one part is already in the next scene and the other one is still in the previous scene. So it's music and sound to use that power of transition. Misdirection is a very cool one. I'll give you quite a few examples. Misdirection is, again, one that draws attention to the transition rather than making it elegant, smooth, and inobtrusive. Great example of question and answer is in Titanic.
So you want to go to a real party?
It's okay, I put my idea. Okay.
Very clear. The question itself creates tension. We want to know what happens next. We won't notice a transition. We're immediately in that next scene, and that then gives the answer to the question, and attention is resolved. An example of thematic transition, thematic echo, you've all seen, I hope, and you may not have realized how it worked exactly, but here it is, the academic approach to 2001's classic cut between the first and the second chapter. This time without the music. So it was the cut from the first chapter that was called The Dawn of Man. And by showing the technology, basically what Kubrick was saying, what you've just witnessed, which is the butchering of one animal by the other, that was actually where mankind originated. So it kind of brought in this element of violence and juxtaposed it with who we are today, technology. Misdirection. Great transition in the movie Highlander, where we have a natural wipe, and it gives us the sense that we're still in the car park, but then we go to a very different place. From Highlander, a misdirection where you believe that we're just leveling up in the car park and we stay in the same time, but we do a flashback to the Middle Ages. In order to properly understand these 5 transition tricks, I'm going to make the distinction more clearly between subject and format. So let's look at those 5 tricks again. The question and answer is something that you write. It has to do with the subject of your story. It is something that's in the scene, in the with the first scene and then the transition scene. It's not something technical. You write it and then you do it. You see the director can still make a different decision on set and have the question answered, but usually that will not happen. So that's subject. It's not a technical decision in the edit, in the post. The thematic echo, same here. It's written in the screenplay. The meaning will follow from the juxtaposing of the subject in the one scene and then the ensuing scene. Misdirection can be a bit of both. Misdirection can be a result of what you wrote, but often the director themselves, they can decide how they present the subject and make you think that you're looking at something else by a crossfade or going from wide to a tight shot. You think you're still in the previous scene and then you widen and you see you're in a different scene. So that doesn't necessarily have to be written in the screenplay by the writer, but I would say it mostly is, and I'll give you a good example with script later in this class of such a misdirection. The micro-macro is, I'd say, almost exclusively technical, because that's the director deciding on the type of shot, whether you're going tight or wide. And you see here in this list, we're going from the writer's responsibility more and more closely to the director's responsibility. We end with music and sound, which is almost always a decision made in post. And that is often to make that transition more seamless in cases where otherwise it might have felt like a rupture in the story. There are more tricks than in the list by Craig Mazin and John August, and I wanted to give you a few that I found interesting or important. One of them you already know. You saw this scene earlier in our masterclass. I'll play it again and see if you can find out what sort of transition we have here.
Without Scream, we have no power. Yes, it's dangerous work, and that's why I need you to be at your best. I need scarers who are confident, tenacious, tough, intimidating. I need scarers like James P. Sullivan.
Hey, good morning, Metropolis. It's now 5 after the hour of 6 a.m. in the big monster city.
So this is a variation on the same principle we see with question and answer. We have a question, then we have an answer. Here we have some sort of an announcement or a declaration, a statement, and then the illustration of that. So I would call it an illustration, and we'll have different forms of illustration where the next scene illustrates what we heard in dialogue in the previous scene. Another classic example comes from The Matrix.
I think we can handle one little girl. I sent 2 units. They're bringing her down now.
No, Lieutenant, your men are already dead.
So what this trick does is making this transition smooth, elegant, seamless by using anticipation. We visualize the words from the previous scene. As a viewer, we anticipate what that would look like, and then we get to see it. And often there's a surprise. Often it is a little bit different from expected. Often it gives us a different slant. It gives us some surprise. But sometimes this illustration is necessary because it's a complicated, a difficult, or a transition that is concerning to the writer, where you're not 100% sure whether the viewer will get it. So then your illustration is going to explain, is going to guide us from one scene into the next. And here's an example from Little Women, where that was essential because we are moving forward in time from one season to the next, and the narration clarifies that.
In the spring, we turned Orchard House upside down with preparations for Meg to attend Sally Moffat's coming out.
It was from Gillian Armstrong's Little Women 1994, if you want to check it out. But it's a technique that you will have seen in other films, making that transition from one time frame into the next more elegant by adding narration over the transition. That's kind of like the lubricant to not jar the audience, because you don't want them to be confused and lose the plot. Another type of transition that is really common, that is not so I'd say, inventive or unusual, but you do it all the time without even realizing it, is the ellipsis. Alfred Hitchcock said films are ordinary life with the boring bits cut out, and that's exactly what this type of transition does. It cuts out the boring bits. So you can tell there was a whole lot of driving going on that was not of interest to the story. So we cut to the end of the trip, and that's a form of ellipsis, just leaving out the uninteresting bits. At the same time, we saw driving and movement. Motion is a very powerful way of creating transition from one scene to the next as well. So I would add that to the list as one of the techniques. I found that in one of the references, by the way, and I'd like to share that with you guys. I might put it in the email following up to this class, in which I also give you the link to the download, to the recording. A transition that is rarely mentioned, and I think is a very important one if you're in the business of writing whodunits. In many whodunits, right after we see the crime, we see the perpetrator, and then we don't realize it. Then the whole film is going to be, who is the perpetrator? We already saw the perpetrator right after the crime was committed. We didn't see at the time of the crime who did it. We saw it afterwards. The other way around, in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, we see a foreshadowing. We see a scene with a character who's seemingly innocent, and then in the next scene, we see the theft of a sword that we will later learn was essentially committed by the same innocent-looking character. So here she's preparing to go to sleep. End of the day, so she can't possibly be the perpetrator, right? But by placing the two scenes in each other's vicinity, we've subliminally set up that connection. There we go. Fleeting shadow. The sword's going to be robbed, and we'll learn later on that was the character we just saw. So by creating a transition from or to the perpetrator of a crime that becomes the mystery of the story, you have subliminally set up a reason for the audience to then accept when the truth is revealed at the end of the story. A more common transition type is where we match shapes, where we match visual hooks. It's often called a visual hook or a visual echo. Here's an example from Edward Scissorhands.
And the rest of the neighbors, they're really very nice. There's no need to be nervous. They're so eager to meet you. You just have to be yourself.
Myself?
That's right, just your own sweet self.
In this case, you would write in the screenplay dissolve to. Why? Because that indicates a change of the world or the time frame or the reality of the scene. In this case, we go from the present to the past. It's a memory of Edward. It could have been cut. You can do a cut on a matching shape, but in this case, it was going into the flashback. And flashbacks are really important when it comes to transitions. You need to find a transition that is smooth so the audience buys the flashback, and again, they're not confused or jarred by it. Another great example of matching shapes is at the beginning of Apocalypse Now.
Lost in a romance, wilderness of pain, and all the children are
quite complex montage, the use of that shape of the fan and the helicopter. There was an audio pre-roll, so that we heard the audio of the helicopter while we were seeing the fan. That is a way of making that transition smooth. That could be a play of Francis Ford Coppola in the edit and ultimately coming to this result. But the camera movement that really focuses on the fan indicates otherwise. So it was clearly shot that way on purpose to then be matched with the helicopter. So matching shapes or visual hook, a visual echo. And Nandi, I saw your question. We'll get back to the thematic echo in a minute. So I hope to answer your question. And by the way, after this segment, I'll have a brief pause and allow you all to ask questions. Another example of the matching shapes you can have when a photo is taken and then immediately thereafter we see the actual photo on the screen. This is LA Confidential.
Bloody Christmas. The press love to label. Officer White, you should know this is bigger than the police board. The grand jury's convening. Indictments may be handed down. Will you testify?
No, sir, I won't.
The reason these matching shapes work is they provide continuity. So there's something in the next image that refers back to the previous image. It makes it easier for us to follow, to create a thread in our mind. So continuity through this matching shapes. Now this technique of taking a photo and then going back to it is used very often. Sometimes to create the cohesion outside the actual transition. In the next shot in Chinatown, you will see the photos taken, then the drama continues, and only then we have the transition referring back to the photo. Here's what I mean.
When you get so much publicity, you gotta get blasé about it. Let's face it, Jake, you're practically a movie star.
Hey, Karel, if I may.
Sure, go ahead, Lee.
I'm seeing pre-lap written on a few scripts, and obviously the sound. What's the correct way of formatting that? I haven't quite formulated it in my head when to use it, when not to use it. Is there any guidance there?
I would say pre-lap is one of those really technical terms that I would reserve for the director. There's a very elegant way for the screenwriter to do it without even venturing into technical territory, and that's by using voiceover. By just having the line of dialogue said in voiceover over the previous scene, and then we enter the next scene and then that dialogue continues within the scene. Does that make sense?
It does, and then it does definitely. And an additional question: if that then becomes audio or score, is that another technicality?
I'd say
I know. Yeah.
Non-diegetic music, as in the score that's composed after the fact, that's not part of the story. I wouldn't mention it. I would not bring that into the film, unless. If you make it diegetic, sometimes you have those instances, and they work quite well, where it feels like you have score music come in. Say, you hear Beethoven's Ninth starts playing, right, at the end of the scene, and then we go into the next scene and we see someone playing a gramophone record. So that the non-diegetic then becomes diegetic. In that case, you can do it.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I would stay away from it. It's really director's territory.
Right, thank you.
All right, let's keep going, and we are going back to the 3 C's. For those of you who were here for the class on writing style and writing the script, we talked about the 3 C's that were clarity, concision, and color. Clarity, concision, and color. I believe that the transition too must adhere to these qualities in their own way. They need to be clear. In the sense that when you are in your normal flow, you don't want to stop and make the audience breathe at the juncture of an act or a sequence. If you want to create a continuous experience, the transition must be clear. It means we need to understand where we are, and there needs to be an element of continuity. So when we land in the new scene, we feel at home. We're not disoriented, and we don't have to figure out things before we can go back to the story, because the worst thing that might happen is that we lose track of the story. So clarity remains the number one rule here as well. A transition too needs to be concise. I had an example that I was going to play yesterday. I decided not to do it because it's so long. It's a transition in Barry Lyndon, the Stanley Kubrick film that is revered for its cinematographic qualities. And there is this one transition where we cut from a character making an appointment for our hero, and then we see the hero in that appointment, and the shot goes from close up to extreme wide, and it takes about 30 seconds. That's not concise. I don't think today you would get away with it, except for an audience that is watching the film in a festival or in an art house theater. But if you write for a living, you don't write auteur work, you write work that can be easily visualized and where the story keeps moving. So your transition needs to be concise. Finally, instead of colorful, I'd say it needs to be compelling. This compelling can take two meanings. If the transition needs to be inobtrusive, elegant, smooth, seamless, and unconscious, then there needs to be some sort of anticipation. You need to want to go into the next scene. And the question answer is a great example. So that compels you to go into that next scene. Compelling when you want to highlight the transition would mean fun. Something that's fun to look at, that elevates your cinematic experience. I love that phrase. And I think the Highlander transition was a good example. It's a compelling transition. It's a transition you remember. I saw this movie in the 1980s. I still remember that transition, and I went back to it for this class. So these are the 3 C's for the writing of transitions. Clear and concise, just like the writing in your style, and compelling to keep the audience engaged with the film. Now, the biggest chapter in today's class: time, place, and action. This is how you define a scene. A scene is identified or characterized by a unity of time, place, and action. That's definition comes from theater, and in film it becomes somewhat fluid. Maybe in theater the action is fluid as well. Although time and place are very clear. When we jump forward in time, we usually know in film. When we change locations, we usually know because we see it. When an action changes, it's not always equally clear, because depending on who is experiencing the film, they might see one action as being more important than another, more prevalent. But as the writer, you should know what the action is. Usually the action relates to the objective of the character. What are they trying to achieve in the scene? So these 3 will help you in writing transitions, because in a transition, usually one of these will change. Because if they all stay the same, you're still in the same scene and you have no transition. There may be a new shot, but you don't have a scene transition. So in this class, we're particularly interested in transitions from one scene to the next. So at least one of these elements needs to change. Many cases, and the clearest examples of scene transitions, are where each of those change. You need to create a clear break from where we were before. In the next scene, we're going to be a new time, a new place, and it's going to be a new action. Here is a scene from Kung Fu Hustle, or at least the transition from one scene to the next. And you'll see everything changes with a clear and quite abrupt cut. This man's just fallen out of the window. We think he's dead. This cut is the equivalent of a cut to white. So you saw the sky. That's the same as, cutting to white and then fading into the next scene or similar. So it's a clean sweep. So we go from one scene and then change all 3 elements for the next scene. And to do that very clearly, no confusion that we are essentially in a new time, place, and action is by cleaning the frame. And that could be by having one color go extremely close on one element, one object that then fills the entire screen, or in this case, the sky. Another example of transition where everything changes is in The Untouchables. I warn you for the violence and the gore, it's going to be bloody, but it's important because it shows the contrast with the scene that follows. And there is what I would call a thematic echo here as well.
I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen. God bless.
This sort of transition with extreme contrast is common in horror films. And the film was directed by Brian De Palma, who's quite versed in the horror genre. And so here, what he wants to show is the difference in the worlds of Al Capone and Elliot Ness. Now, Elliot Ness will try to catch Al Capone. And the question that this transition calls for is this man going to be up to the task? He lives in this, idyllic, pristine, beautiful, peaceful existence. And he's going to have to leave that world and go into the world of Al Capone. So we see what Al Capone is capable of. So that carries a thematic resonance when we cut from one scene into the next. And that's what I would call the thematic echo. It is an example of a transition where everything changes, time, place, and action. And it is underscored by the contrast between the two. So it is blatantly obvious that these worlds are different. In the next example from the sci-fi movie Moon, where in the point of view of the main character, we'll see an accident that happens to them, and then we see the cut to the next scene. Now, it is obvious that there's a big difference between the two scenes, and he will have passed out. It looks like he's in a hospital or in a sick bay or something. But later in the story, we'll learn that there is quite a more profound difference between those two shots, between those two scenes. And I think that is underscored by the fade out. So we'll see at the end of the first scene that you'll see, at the end of the first scene, there's a fade out. And when we come into what is essentially a new character, and he opens with a profound question that may not seem that profound at the time when we watch the film, but it gets its resonance later in. Where am I? Strong break between the two scenes through the fade out, the fade to black. And that also carries thematic resonance in this respect. But that only comes across later. It's not immediately obvious, but it's a sense of foreshadowing here. A clear break, change of time, place, and action as well. In this shot from Gattaca, partially director's job, because I would say this is heavily colored, even though we are in some sort of deserty environment and the hues are yellow. And then we cut to a scene that has contrast in every sense. We go from dry to wet, from yellow to blue, from wide to more tight. And I think it's another good example of cleaning the frame, going for a shot in the second half of the transition then, where it fills the entire screen to really start from scratch almost.
Your eyes look different.
I guess it must be the light.
Must be.
In our next example, you'll get to see two transitions quickly succeeding one another. One, a fade out, and then a cut into the next scene. Change of time, place, and action. Massive change in the story. This is at a halfway point, a midpoint reversal of Little Miss Sunshine. And that then is followed by another clear cut that is a response to the dialogue of Olive in the second scene.
Mom? Dad?
What is that?
Grandpa won't wake up.
Great example of concision here as well. No time's wasted, we cut straight into the next action. What does it look like in the screenplay? And are we absolutely sure that this fade out was intended by the screenwriter? Well, it was. This is the script by Michael Arndt, and clearly he's written at this midpoint reversal, fade to black, because he understands that this is a pivotal moment in the story, literally pivotal in this sense. And so it is in the script. This is an example of a pre-roll lead. This is exactly what we meant earlier. Instead of writing pre-roll, you have the voice in voiceover, and then we go into the scene, and then Olive is present in that scene. I'm going to conclude our class today with a few examples where we have a unity of these three elements. Actually, there's quite a few clips coming still, and I hope we get through it. So we start with the unity of time, and then we'll have examples of unity of place and action, because that then becomes the element you can play with. In this case, the two scenes we see play at the same time. So the time is continuous. There's no rupture in the time, only place and action change, such as this example in E.T.
Say hi. Can you talk? Can you say hi?
Good example of visual continuity, matching shape between the frog and E.T.'s finger. Plays at the same time, but there's a change in place and action. This is from Gravity. Now, it seems that there's a continuity of action, but there isn't. If you look at the script and you really break down the story, a new action starts. She's just completed one job, and she's going to start a new job inside the spacecraft. So the place changes. We go from exterior to interior. The action changes. The only thing that is continuous is time. And often doors help us with making those barriers clearly signaling these thresholds. And here the same happens in space. Gravity, a film that seems to be happening almost continuous. You signal the breaks between the scenes using a change in place and action. The next example is an interesting one. I want you to pay attention. This is from 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. And it's an example of a transition that is prepared. We're very concerned about continuity. We want to make sure the audience know where and when we are in this case. So as we are with the main character in the car, we see a few characters cross the street. Those are the characters that we will see in the next scene. So the time is continuous. Place and action change. But because we see those characters previously, there is a a great sense of continuity, and the scene and the film keeps flowing more elegantly.
If love can be and still be lonely, where does that leave me and you?
Hey.
Time there was and time there will be. Where does that leave me and you?
Sorry I'm late, Denise.
Did you put up those billboards to fuck with the cops yet?
They're up.
You go, girl. You go fuck those cops up.
What the fuck do you think you're doing, Welby? A bunch of billboards like that? You didn't think there'd be some kind of ramifications legally?
What's legal ramifications, Cedric?
You want me to explain the legal ramifications? A little punk like you? And don't call me Cedric!
There is a continuity because we saw the characters previously, but there's also a continuity in the dialogue and the swearing between the two characters. I'm going to skip the next one. That was from Michael Clayton. We're going straight to Westworld. Continuous time, but a clear break in the place and the action.
Keeping this in real time. Switch me over to an online status, now do it manually. Okay, you've got a 3 millisecond cycle delay from shipping computers. I don't know what to do if the stagecoach is late.
It's a great contrast in the feel. We have the high-tech interior, and then we go to the classic Western exterior. The time is continuous. In the next example, we have the opposite. We go from the Western environment to the high-tech in Westworld, the TV series. You'll see very different in pace. The reason is that what you're going to see right now is at a juncture of acts. So this is not just a break between scenes, it's also a break between two larger structural elements, or higher level structural elements. And that's where you can have a transition that is a little bit more leisurely paced.
Oh my God, they're so lifelike. Look at that one. He's perfect.
Perfect is boring. I'm more interested in the bad guys.
It takes its time for a reason. It gets away with it. Westworld, the TV show, transition where we have a continuing time, change of place and action. The next example is from The Truman Show. And I think this is a really interesting example because time again is continuous, but not only do place and action change, they expand. They expand massively for the experience of the viewer.
Truman. That's why I came by tonight. Sure, he's got quite a story to tell. Go to him.
This is a midpoint reversal where he meets with his dad. And this is the new scene where we see the show creator. So now we know there's a different storyline happening. Example of a natural wipe from Sunset Boulevard. Some of you may have seen this before. End of Act 1.
It was all very queer. But queerer things were yet to come.
This is an example of a continuing place, a unity of place. Time and action are going to change. It's the end of a day. We stay in the house, we even stay in the room, but we end the time, we end the day with a natural wipe to black. A really interesting example of the same but done differently technically is from Laura. That's the Otto Preminger murder mystery from 1944, in which the main character falls asleep. He's a detective, falls asleep in the apartment of the woman he believes was murdered, was killed, and whose murder he has been investigating. And you'll see in this scene, he falls asleep. In the next scene, the woman walks into her apartment. She's still alive. But there's no cut. So the transition is imaginary. The transition is in our minds. The camera motion is fluid. So this could be seen as some form of misdirection. And this is the scene break. And this is the new scene. This is from Laura, movie by Otto Preminger, 1944. And she's the title character. The movie was so popular that the most popular name in 1945 for girls born in the US was Laura. And the theme that you heard was composed by David Rexon, a composer that I once met, is still so popular that it is used in the new Apple Plus movie with Bill Murray and Rashida Jones. Another of my favorites, Taylor Sheridan, this is from his film Wind River, where we have a strong continuity of place and a change of time and action. Yesterday, Alex, a student of the first session, pointed out that this is a variation to the Silence of the Lambs example, where in the finale we have an example of unity of time, a misdirection, but then we have a changing of the place and the action. Here, the place stays the same. So it's not the exact same example. So the place has the unity, but the time and the action change. To understand what you're going to watch, you need to know the story of Wind River is about a girl who was raped and murdered. And this team is going to investigate, and they go to the trailer of the boyfriend. The boyfriend is inside, and they want to talk to him. So this is what we see.
Can I help you?
Yeah, I'm looking for my knight in shining armor. I think this is
So a wonderful example of a transition into a flashback by unity of place. And there's misdirection, because we believe that we're still in the present, but we're not. A similar example we have in Titanic, when we stay with the boat, but we go back in time. So it's a unity of place, change of time and action.
Titanic was called the ship of dreams. And it was. It really was.
This is written in the screenplay. This is not a decision by the director to implement this. In the case of Titanic, James Cameron was the writer and the director. That was not the case in Wind River. Taylor Sheridan wrote it. But hang on, I think he did direct it. I take it back. So these are examples of writer-directors of each of these films. Both Wind River, Titanic, and also our next example from Lone Star, written and directed by John Sayles. After this clip, I'm going to show you how he wrote it in the screenplay. It's interesting. It's not the way I would recommend it, but it is clear nonetheless. Lone Star, unity of place, changing the time and the action.
Charlie was one of your old-fashioned bribe or bullets kind of sheriffs. He took a healthy bite out of whatever moved through this county. It was in here one night, back when Jimmy Herrera ran the place. Started over a basket of tortillas.
Beaner Fair doesn't agree with me, but the price sure is right. Jimmy got a kitchen full of wetbacks, most of them relatives. People breed like chickens. So?
And we have Matthew McConaughey becoming the lead in this film. Check it out. Lone Star. This is the place in the script. And as you notice, there is no slug line. We have a change of a change of time and action, but there's no slug line. We stay in the same place. This is how Sayles wrote this. We pan down to the table. The food has changed. Tortillas are in a straw basket instead of plastic. The jukebox changes to another song and the light dims slightly. So the whole paragraph is already in the past. So I would have placed the slug line above that just for clarity. But maybe for readability and to indicate that this is the way he's going to film it, he keeps the reader in the illusion and we read it in the exact same way we experience it on the screen. We're not aware of the slug line as we watch the film. We're not aware that we are in a new scene. We're really seduced into it. But I wanted to give you two examples of unity of action, where time and place change, but the action remains the same. That can make for a really interesting effect. First example is from Citizen Kane.
I thought you'd see it my way.
So a clear example of a continuing action, although we have a crossfade. The crossfade or the dissolve indicates a change in time. So moving forward in time, the place changes, but the action is the same. It's still the same character singing. This is from Nightcrawler.
Flores was then transferred to St. Joseph's Hospital in serious but stable condition after suffering smoke inhalation.
We'll see our main character sitting and observing this action. The same way he was sitting observing the TV. And although it's not the exact same physical action, it is part of the bigger action of stealing the bike and then selling it.
I don't know. I'll give you 500.
This is a custom racing bicycle, sir, designed for competitive road cycling. This bike has a lightweight space-age carbon frame and handlebars positioned to put the rider in a more aerodynamic posture.
So it's quite sophisticated. It's not obvious from the first moment that this is a continuing action. It is a clear break in time and place. But later then we realize that he was all along planning to steal this bike and then sell it. Here's one example from Midsummer, where we have a continuing action, but a clear break in time and place. So we're no longer in the apartment, we're now on the plane. Similarly, classic ending to North by Northwest, a similar action where initially we're on the rocks.
Here, reach, now.
At Mount Rushmore.
I've got you. Up.
I can't make it.
Yes, you can. Come on.
Harder.
Come along, Mrs. Thornhill.
And then we're on the train.
All right, this is silly.
I know, but I'm sentimental.
And a bonus transition with thematic resonance. Now, Hitchcock is the master. He's the absolute master. That transition from Mount Rushmore to the train is at the same time a great example of concision. It is Hitchcock cutting out the boring bits straight from the resolution of the tension to the aftermath and a couple together. And then we have the thematic shot at the end. We know what that image means because, after all, Hitchcock is a dirty old man, isn't he? I'm going to end this class with the transition scenes. We're familiar with establishing shots. This is an example of day, night, day from the film Gallipoli.
All this watch business.
Well, when you point 12 o'clock to the sun, north is halfway between the hour hand and 12. Can you ride, please?
Yeah. Why?
Just wondered why you didn't try for the light horse.
Didn't want to.
What are you going to join, the infantry?
Not joining anything.
But you got to be in it.
Don't have to if you don't want to.
You got to be.
No, I don't. Free country, haven't you heard?
Be ashamed of myself if I didn't fight.
Well, that only proves one thing, that you and I are different. Let's drop it, eh?
You of all people should be going. Why me of all people?
With this, I wanted to show that essentially the first and the last are the transition. It's the walking that is the transition. We also want to show the forward, the movement forward in time, and the dialogue in the middle is really the only story element. Transition scenes. Here's a transition scene from Casablanca. Again, changing of time, unity of place. We go from day to night. And that's the intro into the scene. That is classic. So these are transition scenes. The one you know is the establishing shot, the outside of the building. We had a few. We had the sacred city in Beijing, the day, night, day, and then repeated action. When you have a series of shots, sometimes they are also considered transition scenes. Any questions?
My one question, an example of maybe micro, macro. I was thinking the one that jumped into mind was adaptation, the orchid.
I bet you it is the most common transition you will find, but there's nothing that comes to mind right now. I mean, I had that Michael Clayton example where we go on the basket of keys, coming from the wide exterior to the basket of keys interior. There's that Barry Lyndon where we have the two characters talk about the meeting, and then at the meeting we see the table with the guns, which is again micro macro. But if you start looking out for it, you'll realize that is a very, very common transition. It's not unusual at all. But I'm going to make a note, and I think adaptation is a great example, because yes, the orchids are the micro, the tight shot that then is followed by the wide. Thank you. That makes sense. Katie says, in a whodunit, you see the culprit right after the crime, which is helpful because that's what I'm working on right now. Good, excellent. And Nolene says, I love the idea of transitioning, asking a question. Yes, that is the easiest and arguably one of the most powerful techniques. Use it. It will make the read for your readers and producers more easy. Nani says, what I got out of this class was that we see all these transitions in films, but now I realize how a writer can use them to tighten a screenplay. Absolutely. Good. Well done, guys. Thanks for joining. I'm going to edit this all together. I'll send you the link. Hopefully that'll happen within the next week. Alternatively, there'll always be the rough version uploaded for your reference. Also, in case you ever miss a class, it'll always be there. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in a week's time. Take care. Bye.